While I was scrolling through the vastness of the internet, I stumbled upon this article. And when I saw the title, it made my spider sense tingle a bit. Basically, the title says, no RPG needs to be longer than 40 hours. And when you think about it, this is actually a great topic because it cuts to a debate that's becoming more relevant as game budgets and prices keep increasing. Now, I think the article makes somewhat solid points, but it also overstates its case with a 40-hour tops rule. Here is how I would break it down. The biggest issue isn't that RPGs are long. I would say the biggest issue is that many are padded. What does that actually mean? Well, a lot of modern RPGs mistake content for value. Instead of adding meaningful quests, they add stuff like repetitive fetch quests, copy-paste dungeons, excessive crafting, unnecessary level grinding, bloated dialogue, or huge empty maps. And I bet my ass you can identify several games that are doing this bullshit. So basically what happens, you as a player, you are spending 20 hours doing activities that could have been cut without hurting the experience. One example that comes to mind is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and rightfully so because it has been often criticized for exactly this. The main story can easily stretch past 60 hours because the game constantly forces you through regional story arcs that often feel disconnected from the central narrative. And I know because I played the game and I experienced exactly that. I was basically doing these regional story arcs because I wanted to clear the map, but also I wanted to gear up my character, and suddenly I completely forgot what's the main plot all about. And let me tell you, that's not epic. That's a textbook pacing problem. Another thing that this article is mentioning is that people want their $80 worth of time invested in the game. And I actually think this mindset isn't fully outdated. However, I would argue most people would rather play one incredible 30-hour RPG than one mediocre 100-hour RPG. Simply put, nobody finishes a fantastic 30-hour game wishing there had been another 40 hours of filler. Essentially, quality creates value, not runtime. However, psychologically speaking, if you paid $60 for something and you invested 60 hours in it, especially if the game was marketed like that, then you can kinda feel okay, in a sense that it was $1 per hour value. On the other hand, if the trailers were promising all kinds of wild stuff, and you actually believe it because rarely people will show proper gameplay, and then you play the game and all its gameplay elements and story and feature and all that stuff is very fucking bad, naturally you're gonna feel bad because you spent so much money and you received barely 30 hours of game time. Which, by the way, more often than not, it's mediocre at best. So yeah, the value argument does and does not hold, but it fully depends on the situation. And it should not be generalized, because if we had the ability to do so with games, we would have completely different landscape in front of us. The final point that the article is mentioning that I sort of agree with is that 40 hours is enough for almost any story. Now, if you look outside gaming, for example Lord of the Rings Extended Trilogy, or Game of Thrones, or Breaking Bad, these stories introduce dozens of characters, multiple plot points, politics, betrayals, emotional arcs, and satisfying conclusions. Except obviously Game of Thrones, but we don't talk about that. Anyway, 40 hours could be considered an enormous amount of time to tell a story. Which brings me to my next point, which is, if an RPG still hasn't gotten to the point after 40 hours, that's probably a writing issue. However, there is a much better rule to judge a game by, and I personally believe a much better philosophy would be this. An RPG should only be as long as its best ideas last. For example, some games can justify a 20-hour story, some games do with 35, some do with 60, some do with more than 100 hours. But the problem starts when developers continue adding content after they've already exhausted their mechanics or narrative. And you can easily tell when a game has started recycling itself. So, like I said, there is not a golden rule, and when you think about it, there isn't a blueprint what kind of length the main story should be for an RPG. And that's one of the reasons The Witcher 3 The Wild Hunt is so highly regarded, because you can roll credits after a reasonable amount of time, but if you are interested in the world, there are a dozen more hours waiting for you, and everybody wins. Overall, you could say that the issue isn't length, and I don't think it will ever be. The main issue is respect for the player's time. A game shouldn't deliberately slow progression with repetitive objectives, force grinding, oversized maps, or filler dialogue simply to advertise 100+ hours of gameplay. But same thing goes in the opposite direction. If you have a 20-hour game, but the story is dogshit, you bet your ass I'm going to be upset when I paid 60, 70, even $80 for that product, only to get basically nothing. And also, let's not forget about one main thing here. Everybody has a different value perception. And because of that, different people will have different opinions. However, you can still make a point if you give a proper example why this particular game is too long or why the other game is too short. And that descriptive element is all that matters. Because, for example, you could say The Witcher 3 is too long, but if you cannot give a proper reason why that is a problem, then there is no problem whatsoever to begin with. And that's why it's always better to read a review or listen to someone who is doing this stuff on YouTube, a reviewer that you trust, for example, whereby you can see through their content that they have actually played the game and pointed out what was good and what was bad about it, regardless of the length of the said game. And as my final thought, I would say this. The RPGs people remember most aren't usually remembered because they were long. In fact, I've never seen that ever being a case. They are remembered because every hour felt worthwhile. And that's basically my take on this news. Thanks very much for watching, and as always, like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And that's it from me, until the next one.